So, this week's Dynamite was a special show entitled Road Rager, and started off with a strap match between Cody Rhodes and QT Marshall. And I guess this was supposed to be the ending, or at least one of the chapters of the rivalry between Cody Rhodes and QT Marshall after QT Marshall split off from the Nightmare family. Pretty violent match. There was this one point where QT Marshall was busted open, and I think it really helped add to the realness and the finality of this feud. And the match ends when QT spits at Cody, and Cody just completely kills him with a bunch of crossroads before winning the match. So like I said, while this does have a certain air of finality to it, you never know because QT Marshall could just as well be looking for revenge in the future. Then there was a segment backstage where Shawn Spears was talking smack to Sammy Guevara, so Sammy Guevara re-gifted the chair shot he suffered last week during his match with MJF. And then in a segment very similar to last week, which is a big problem to me, Kenny Omega was interviewed again and basically said the same thing, how there was nobody to challenge him for the championship at Fight for the Fallen. And then once again, Evil Uno came out, except this time it actually got physical when Kenny Omega low-blowed Evil Uno. And then each of their respective groups came out before Kenny Omega and Adam Page had a standoff, teasing a world championship match between them at Fight for the Fallen. Then Ethan Page and Darby Allin sat down for an interview with good old JR and hyped up their coffin match next week at Fyter Fest. And then we had a 6-man tag team match where the Inner Circle, Jake Hager, and LAX with Conan faced off against the Pinnacles, Wardlow, and FTR. Tully Blanchard interfered to give the Pinnacle the win, and then Conan came in afterwards and hit Wardlow with his sock before Tully Blanchard took out Conan. At this point, I feel like most of AEW is revolved around the Pinnacle versus the Inner Circle because we got the two mid-carders of both teams going at it backstage earlier in the night, and now we have a 6-man tag team match with the remaining members. Not to mention we have the two leaders, Chris Jericho and MJF, still building up for their match. And speaking of that, next we had the standoff between MJF and Chris Jericho, where basically they set up the terms that Chris Jericho will have to follow if he wants a match with MJF. So basically, Chris is going to have to wrestle 4 opponents of MJF's choosing, each with a different stipulation, and if he can get past those 4 opponents, then he gets one more match with MJF. Jericho accepted and then took out MJF with a Judas effect. Then the best friends, no, not those two, these two. Tony Schiavone and the AEW Women's World Champion Dr. Britt Baker had a conversation where basically Britt Baker hyped up the title match that she'll have with Nyla Rose at Fyter Fest Night 2, and basically said that Nyla was never getting her title back. And then Roman Sionis made his AEW in-ring debut against Matt Sydal, and I'm honestly really glad that Andrade is being treated like the star that he is, or he's at least being used, and that he's not in the back just doing nothing. But anyways, Andrade finishes the match with his signature driving knees into the corner, and I thought he was also going to retain his hammerlock DDT, but he made a little bit of a variation on it by turning it into a hammerlock reverse STO, which he calls El Idolo. But Andrade hits El Idolo on Matt Sydal and pins him to win the match, and then further attacked Matt Sydal after the match to establish himself as a threat, which I loved. And as much as I said that I was stoked that Andrade was here in AEW and was finally being used, it was nothing compared to what happened next, because Arn Anderson was in the ring being interviewed by Tony Schiavone, and Aleister fucking Black made his AEW debut, and I lost my shit. Honestly, I thought towards the tail end of his WWE career that he should honestly just go to AEW and revert back to his Tommy End character, kind of like how Dean Ambrose reverted back to Jon Moxley. And personally, I really would have liked to see Tommy End, and I guess technically I did, because they said that Tommy End was just the vessel for a character called Malachi Black. But personally, what I really wanted to see was Tommy End join the Dark Order as its new leader, because I think they are the group that kind of needs one. And rest in peace to Mr. Brody Lee. I mean, he will always be the godfather of the Dark Order, but if they needed a new leader, honestly, I can't think of anybody better than Tommy end, because everything about his character in WWE and his new character Malachi Black in AEW just screams Dark Order. But we'll see what happens with him going forward. But anyways, Malachi Black hit his signature Black Mass roundhouse kick on both Arn Anderson and Cody Rhodes to end the segment. Honestly, I'm so excited to see what he'll do in AEW, much like I'm excited to see what they'll do with Andrade, because those two were two of the most impressive wrestlers in NXT, and they just got ruined when they hit the main roster. So I'm really excited to see them finally being treated as the stars that they are. And I think it really just goes to show how much talent and potential WWE is letting slip through their fingers. Then came a mixed tag team match with Chris Statlander and Orange Cassidy facing off against the Bunny and the Blade. And the match ends when Statlander dropped the Bunny with the Big Bang Theory to get the win. And then in a really weird segment, next we had Tony Schiavone trying to interview American Top Team founder Dan Lambert, who was in attendance with UFC welterweight Jorge Masvidal and the UFC women's bantamweight and featherweight world champion Amanda Nunes. And to be honest, I was kind of surprised to see them in the crowd. I don't know, maybe it's just that I feel like MMA fighters kind of look down on professional wrestling, so I wasn't really expecting them to be there, and I initially thought that Nunes and Masvidal were only here because UFC 264 was this weekend. My money's on Dustin, by the way. But then I remembered that Masvidal and Nunes were both from Florida, which is where the night's Road Rager event was being held. Okay, so I'm editing this now the morning after UFC 264, and while I did get it right, I don't think even I could have predicted that the fight would end like that. Holy shit. But anyways, they did a segment where Dan Lambert was railing AEW and said it sucked before the murder hawk Lance Archer came out and laid out Lambert in front of his own fighters, which I thought was kind of funny because it looked like they really enjoyed Dan being a part of the show and getting laid out on national television. And then it was time for our main event, where the AEW World Tag Team Championships were on the line in a street fight. And this was basically the continuation from last week's match. And once again, both teams' allies came down to help out in the match, which again, I'm not a fan of. I honestly wish we could just have a normal tag team match to see who's the better team instead of having all this screwy stuff happen in these matches. The Good Brothers came out again to try to help the Young Bucks, while Kazarian came out to try to help Eddie and Penta. But at the end of the day, this time the Young Bucks pick up the win after Nick Jackson stuffed Eddie's mouth with a bunch of thumbtacks, and then Matt finished Eddie off with a super kick while the thumbtacks were still in his mouth. So the Young Bucks retained the titles, and I guess we'll see what happens next week at Fyter Fest.